All right. Hello, everyone out there. I am Thomas Hall. I'm Executive Director of CleanStart. And today we have one of our CleanStart perspectives. First, I want to say these CleanStart perspectives are made possible through support that we get from our sponsors. Our sponsors are SMUD, Bloom, the Wet Center at Fresno State, River City Bank, and Chico Start. And all of these groups are committed to building a clean tech ecosystem here in the Sacramento Valley. And a lot of that, especially when you talk about the work that SMUD and River City Bank does, is around the energy transition, grid infrastructure, transmission and demand, which is actually what we're going to be talking about today. Now, those of you that have gotten on and listened to our discussions in the past you're very familiar with my discussions with people around the grid, innovations around the grid, whether it's grid edge, grid enhancing technologies, distributed energy resources. And we always have this voice that pops up. And I'd say he's the moderating voice of a lot of the excitement that we have around it. And that's why it's a pleasure to welcome on his first perspective as a guest, but not his first perspective, Peter Mackin, Senior Vice President of Power System Studies. I think we've got the title right there, do we?
Well, the title actually has changed, but that's my old title.
Well, I'll let you update it in a second.
Okay.
Uh, but today we're kind of talking about the grid and trying to bring it to reality. Now, some of the things that are a reality of the grid is that over 50% of our grid was built before 1970. Technology has changed since then. And the Biden administration is investing 3.5 billion, which is going to be supporting a total of 8 billion in grid investments they estimate in the United States. And the global power grid is going to require about over $3 trillion by 2030 to meet what they see as the demand in the energy transmission. Now, why do we have to upgrade the grid? Well, I'm going to give three things that are kind of hot in the news. One, renewables don't operate like your standard historical gas plants. And the second one is we have a whole bunch of electrification happening, and that's electric vehicles coming online, which in the United States, it's expected to consume an additional up to 27 terawatt hours of annual power by 2030. And then people like to talk about AI and computing power on the grid. And you might have different beliefs on that, but we're going to see kind of set like what's happening. What is it from someone who's actually planning and building these things from Peter Mackin? So first off, Peter, welcome. And why don't you give me your updated title?
So, yeah, so I've been doing this grid planning studies kind of thing for 40 years now. So it's kind of like old hat for me. So what happened was that title that you presented was when I was at GridBright. GridBright got acquired by the firm that's on my background, Qualis.
Wallace.
And when we went from 70 employees to 1,000 employees, not everybody can be a vice president. So so what happened is my title changed to senior principal engineer. So that's my new title.
Well, I have you here because of all the good comments that you've made in the past and the work that you've done. So I mentioned electric vehicles and the energy
Mhm.
transition here. And basically the big part of them when it comes to the energy transition or where they connect with the grid is charging. And the big debate is, what speed of charging. But if I have let's do a hypothetical here. I'm Thomas Hall. I am a landowner. I have some land right off, five, maybe up north, and I want to make an electric vehicle fast charging station. Now I have a spot. It's perfect. It's right, like what you'd think of a regular gas station. It's right next to maybe a few shops, right off a off ramp. It's a great spot. What are some of the first questions that I need to ask myself if I'm going to be putting something there when it comes to the grid?
Well, I mean, the first thing you have to ask is how many charging ports do you want and how much power do you want in each port? So, for example, if you're thinking Electrify America, which is now I think they're standardizing on 350 kilowatt, and you say, oh, I want oh, 12 ports. I mean, that's a fairly big Electrify America station, but it's a small Tesla station, right? So that's 4 megawatts. And 4 megawatts is basically about a third of the capacity of a 12 kV distribution line. So that means if you think you're gonna put a 4 megawatt load out in the middle of nowhere next to a freeway, you're probably looking at some significant reinforcements to get it hooked up and installed. Now there are ways to mitigate that, but they all cost money. You could say, well, I'm going to reduce my peak power demand by putting batteries in at the same time, and I'll slow trickle charge the not trickle charge, but I'll slowly charge those batteries, and then when I hit peak usage, all 12 of these chargers run at full capacity at once, which will probably only happen for an hour or less a day. Then I'll draw off the batteries instead. So then maybe I only need a megawatt or something to for average load. Then that makes it easier because then, you might be able to get something like that with a little less effort. But you still have to worry about the transformer that connects you to the distribution line. And that's a fairly good sized transformer, a megawatt. And transformers are backlogged from transmission down to distribution. They're like 18 months, 24 months out. So getting something like that hooked up quickly is difficult.
So
Um,
I should have a project planner with me when
yeah,
they.
yeah. Well, I mean, the one thing that's nice about distribution connections is that the utilities, at least in California, they all have free mapping um, data available. So you could basically you sign up for free to access. Sometimes you don't even have to sign up; you can just use it. But you just go to their mapping application and you pick the location where you want to put something, and they will tell you if there's capacity on the distribution system nearby, either for generation or load. Sometimes there's only generation because that's typically what people are more interested in. But some of the utilities will show load too. So then you can look at that and say, okay, well, you know, for example, I want to connect to this distribution line that runs right down the cross highway that goes across the freeway there where the intersection is. But I look at the map and it's all red, and I go, oh darn,
So I have my
so
spot.
I had my spot, but
Yeah.
but but that doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means that there's going to be expenses and time involved to reinforce that line to make it capable of being able to serve that demand that you want.
So let's like then I guess talk about like getting. So I'm building this, 12 unit, 3 I think megawatt hour. Or I think it would be more 4 megawatt hour
Or maybe,
charging station.
well,
Station.
yeah, but again, you just made the mistake that a lot of people make. It's not a megawatt hour. It's a megawatt.
Thank you for correcting me. It's a yeah, it's a megawatt, a 4 megawatt station. And if I want to offset, the demand or the impact of the demand, I could put a battery there. Now, if I put a battery there, then does the utility look at it like let's say I put a giant battery there and I can make it look like a 3 megawatt station. Does the utility look at it that way?
Well, the way they would look at it is you would okay if you design it in such a way that maybe you're going to reduce your, let's just say, your demand in half, so it's 4 megawatt peak but you're going to keep it to maximum of two. Then when you request the connection to the grid, to the utility, you'll tell them, okay, 2 megawatt peak, here's what I'm going to have 4 megawatts of chargers, but I'm going to have batteries in here, and I'm going to have software controlling everything, and I will limit my demand from your system to 2 megawatts. And they have a meter, a
Mhm.
real-time meter, and they can watch you. And in some cases, depending on the size of the project, they'll have their own breaker. And when you sign your agreement to connect to the utility, they'll probably have something in there that says, if you exceed this demand, which is 2 megawatts, we reserve the right to open the breaker and cut you off. And and sometimes they will, because if you overload their system, you can damage the system and put a bunch of other customers at risk. So they'll be pretty quick to cut you off if you violate the rules.
Yeah, that's resiliency has been honestly like the amount of time things in my life don't work. but the lights seem to come on most of the time, even when I was in PG&E territory. So resiliency is definitely the name of the game. I saw a good question in the chat, but I first want to ask you a question around this. So when we're measuring energy and power, as you mentioned, we have watts and watt hours. And we also have, you're talking about peak load, but the time of day of that peak load is incredibly important. If I'm trying to build a, this 4 megawatt system and
Mhm.
trying to make it more appealing to whatever utility or regulator is letting me put it on the grid, I can have batteries, but how much can I convince them that, oh no, I'm only going to use slow times to charge my batteries, and you'll never see a peak, these giant peaks from me that you might see from someone else. Is that something people are doing? Are they able to convince utilities up and ISO of that, or is that nope? You just got to go with what their rules are. I'm hoping to get an answer of like where they're like, no, they just slap on the breaker, and if you mess up, you're done.
Well, there's other things that they can do. Like if you tell them, I want 2 megawatts peak demand, that's what I want. But maybe there's capacity for more. They'll let you go over, but they'll slap you. Well, EV charging is different because there's what's known as, I think, a demand charge holiday, which I think is still in effect. But if you were a regular customer, like a commercial customer or an industrial customer, and you exceeded your demand, which was 2 megawatts, they just slap you with an additional demand charge, which is very expensive. And I think that hangs on for a year. So if you exceed, like in a 15-minute period in 1 month, your demand that you said you were going to use or maximum you were going to have, they'll hit you with a demand charge for what you actually did use, and it'll be on your bill for a year until you show that you're not going to exceed it again. At least I think that's the case. I am not a regulator. I do not
Mhm.
know that much about tariffs, so I could be wrong here. But I know there are demand charges, and I know if you exceed, whatever your peak demand is in a given period, that's the demand charge you pay for a while going forward until until you show that you're not using that much anymore.
Okay, I think you were with us. So Peter and I both are, volunteers at Sacramento Electric Vehicle Association, including Oregon, that's in the audience here. And some of the people from the organization will remember, I want to say back in 2016 or 20, around that time where we did a ride and drive at the Folsom outlets and we're plugging in electric vehicles. And the next month, the Folsom outlets hair was on fire because they got a
Yeah.
demand charge from SMUD. Now, SMUD went and they rectified it. They went and realized that they sponsored a ride and drive, and so they made good on it. But that's a very kind of very real thing that happens out there. Now, let's say I'm going forward with building this project, and I start off with I'm trying to make this general plan of this 4 megawatt station, 12 charging units. What I guess what is kind of the math or cost of making a decision of between like what type of battery I would need versus, hardening the infrastructure to be able to provide me the power?
Well, I mean, essentially you'd be looking at, well, there'd be basically, well, it's basically comes down to dollars and cents. So
Hmm.
you're looking at alternatives. You're looking at an alternative of, I put a certain amount of batteries in there. You'd need, if you wanted to reduce your demand from 4 megawatt to two, you'd need a peak capacity in the battery of 2 megawatts to cover the difference. But then you also have to look at, well, how much energy am I going to be using that exceeds how much energy during all the time that these chargers are being used? How many hours am I going to exceed the 2 megawatts, and how much energy is that, like in a given load cycle, before I have a chance to charge the battery back up again? So then that will determine how much energy capacity you have to have in the batteries, which also affects cost. So you'd be looking at an analysis that says, okay, for the battery alternative, how much megawatt capacity do I need, and how much megawatt hour capacity do I need to be able to meet the charging demand that I expect? And then the alternative would be, okay, I'm not going to worry about that. And well, and then also your cost of electricity, because your cost of electricity at 2 megawatts. Plus with the batteries, you could charge some of the batteries at off-peak times, which might reduce the energy cost to you to charge them up, which then could be used on peak times to charge EVs and basically use a lower cost energy. So you have all of that going into the calculation of how much can I save and how much will it cost to do the battery alternative versus I don't have any batteries and I just pull whenever I need it, I pull the energy from the utility and I pay their given rate or their going rate at the time that I take the power. And you look at those two alternatives, and typically the developer is going to look at costs and go, well, okay, battery alternative is cheaper, so I'm going to go with that. Or just reinforcing the grid and taking the utilities energy at the price that they charge, I'll do that. And of course, you also have to consider, rate increases going forward. So, I mean, it's not an easy calculation, but
Mhm.
it's basically weighing two alternatives
A lot
based
of
on cost.
variables.
Yeah.
So what are the typical costs for like a station like this when you just kind of generally out there? Are these stations costing, to put in, $20 million or not
That,
going to hold you to it. We'll tell you that.
yeah,
Not
well,
gonna get you.
the problem
This
is
isn't a
that
quote.
EV charging stations, our company's done them. I have not, so I really don't know what the costs are. I can tell you, you know, like levelized cost of energy for generation, but unfortunately, I really don't have any information on the cost of a charging station, and it's really going to be site dependent too, because there's
Mhm.
cost of the land, there's the technology that you use for the chargers. If you go with 350 kilowatt chargers, they're going to be more expensive than if you say, well, I'll just stick with 150s or 200s or something.
Yeah, because then you got to also think about how they have to, recoup the cost, and that's by I don't know if they officially call it selling electricity, but I like to call it throughput, and then also potentially generation of regulatory credits, which you can go and see those if you look at a lot of these companies 10Ks and their business segments. So yeah, I think those are it sounds like a big undertaking. Like, what's the kind of time frame that someone could expect if they had a land and they were like, I want to put a charging station here? What type of time frame do you think that they would be looking at
Well, I mean, you've got to do all the permitting, and there may be an
permitting?
environmental impact or environmental assessment you have to do. But if you're looking at just the utility work, if nothing's needed other than, the transformer to connect you and the disconnect switches and all that other stuff the utility would put in, that they don't have to reinforce the feeder back to the station, you 12 to 18 months maybe. I mean, because
Wow.
you got to put in the request to the utility, they got to process it. They may or may not have the transformer in stock and they may have to get one for you. Typically on a distribution level, they'll have a lot of them already there because, transformers fail all the time and they need spares, so they've got them. But you still need time for the utility to schedule the work because I mean, they're doing other stuff already. It's not like
Yeah,
they're
they're,
sitting
they're
on their
getting all
butts,
that
right?
money from the Biden administration to route their grids or
Yeah,
burying lines.
yeah.
Um, so let's switch to the other side of the equation, the supply side of the equation. Now,
Mhm.
we mentioned EVs as taking a lot of new demand, but uh, our goal of all this new supply is for it to be renewables. And I think we all get constantly reminded that the sun doesn't shine at night. So, what are considerations when it comes to grid design or, I guess, distribution and transmission if I wanted to put renewables and get the most out of them? Is it where I want to have, renewables and I have to have a battery now if I want to think towards the future? Or is it, I can still build just a giant solar array, connect it, and feel good?
Well, I mean, the latter you can do. The only problem is are you going to be able to find anybody that wants to take your power when you're generating it rather than when they actually need it? And so the price that you get for just if we're talking solar, just a solar only project is going to be a lot less than if you toss in some battery storage on site so that you can basically shift your generation to the peak time. And you don't necessarily need I mean, a lot of times the generators will, well, it sort of depends. If you're looking at technic technically, I want to be able to shift all of the generation into the peak hours, which are like typically 5 to 9 from, 10 a.m. to 4 a.m. 4 p.m. If you want to shift it all, then you'd probably need pretty close to the capacity of the solar in batteries also, and then enough energy to keep all of that, to store all that energy. But a lot of times people don't look at it that way. They look at it, on a cost basis and a revenue basis. And even though the solar drops off during the peak time, there's what they call RA, or resource adequacy payments, and you get a certain percentage of the capacity for just the solar. And so if you want to get resource adequacy, let's say your solar is 400, well, let's just do 100 megawatts because that's easier number. 100 megawatts, and I'm making these numbers up because I don't know the exact numbers. The solar may get a resource adequacy number, a percentage of say 30%. So that means that if you want to have 100%, 100 megawatts of resource adequacy, you would need 70 megawatts of battery. And that way, because the battery gets 100%, because it can dispatch whenever. So its resource adequacy should be close to 100%. But that also depends on that it's in the right location and that there's transmission to get the power to the load that you need to serve. So we're assuming in all of these cases that there's no transmission constraints. A lot of times there are. So you can do certain things. You can build a project, it's just pure solar if you want, but you won't get as much revenue. Or you could build the solar plus the battery, you'd get more revenue, but of course it would cost you more. But one thing I can say is that I think, because our company does, the Qualis there behind me, does resource integration, resource connection studies, and we prepare applications for customers to connect to the grid. And I can say that pretty much at least 90% of our projects that are renewable, they include battery storage
Okay.
for the reasons that I've been discussing.
I guess that's not surprising. I was honestly surprised that that it's only more recent that we've seen some of these battery projects come online with a lot of them. Now, I think you mentioned that transmission is somewhat of the bottleneck on a lot of these projects on it. Now is transmission purely the domain of, I guess, public or quasi-public entities and CAISO, or is there an opportunity for someone to say, I want to do something that can improve transmission, whether it's, I don't know, a private line or whether it's a battery at a key location where they can provide, I guess, grid services to, alleviate transmission issues? Or is this, something that, like, unless you're part of the monster, uh, the good, nice monster, don't touch?
Well, I mean, generation has been deregulated for decades, which means anybody with enough money has the right to request connection to the grid to, build a generation project and connect it to the grid. You still have to make sure that you have a site that's environmentally okay, that you can actually connect it to the grid, because the utility can't tell you no, you can't connect, but the utility can say, this is a lousy place. It's going to be very expensive, and 50% of your project cost is going to be transmission to get your generation out and to the load. So the utility can't refuse, but usually, when they come back and say something like that, transmission is super expensive, the project dies or withdraws, and they try to find another location simply because they're competing against other projects that are in better locations and are cheaper, so the other projects can sell their power for less, which means nobody will buy yours. And so it's not, you're not gonna get anywhere. But as far as the
You talking to
question
me?
of,
What'd you
as
say?
Hold on. Hold on.
Everybody's eating.
I think that's Gary.
Yeah.
Yeah, as far as the transmission goes, it's not. completely deregulated, but there are ways for private entities to actually build transmission and connect it to the grid. And there's been some examples of things where that's happened. It's not been like individuals, but non-utilities have come forward with proposals to build transmission lines, and then they go through the analysis. They have to request studies from the utility studies it, and typically these lines are, they're not small. I mean, in some cases they are. In some cases they're essentially the generation tie between the generation and the point of interconnection on the grid, and some of those lines are fairly long, but they're basically sole owner lines, and essentially they're considered part of the project, the generation project itself.
Mhm.
But there are other lines, like for example, I think the Sunzia line is a private line. Transwest Express is another private line. Now there's others within the Western interconnection that are also semi-privately held. They're not being built by the utilities that actually serve customers, but they're built by maybe a company that owns some generation, and then they have a subsidiary that builds transmission. And so but typically those projects are a little tougher to build because when a utility builds transmission, they have to get approval from the regulator, and then the regulator will say, okay, it's just and reasonable, I think is the wording. And so the costs that you expended to build this transmission line, you can recover in rates from the ratepayers. So basically their ratepayers
Yeah.
rates go up a little bit, and they also get to make a rate of return on the investment. But with a private entity, that's not the case because they don't have any customers. So they have to figure out a way to sell transmission service on that line and make enough money from the transmission service to pay for the cost of building the line. And again, it's happened. They've built them. I think, like I said, Sunzia, I don't. It's not in service, but I think it's under construction. And there's a bunch of other lines that are fairly well along in the environmental process. Like I mentioned, Transwest Express, that one, I know I think they've completed their environmental work. They're not. I don't think they're under construction yet, but
And
they're getting close.
I note on the, at least if you were to go and look at more at your Asia, you'd see a whole lot more private transmission lines and even private interconnections that are being developed out there. Now, I want to play a little game with you on the
Okay.
technologies that are on the grid.
Okay.
And we're going to call this game Pop or Punk. Now, for those of you that don't know, I really like punk rock. And others, if you've been to an event where Peter and I have been at, you would know that Peter likes Kiss, I believe.
Well, that's one
And
of them.
well, that's one of them, but he likes the pop heavy metal. He might be offended by that that description of it.
Pop and heavy metal are oxymoron, I think.
Get the
Heavy metal is its own genre.
and I more people listen to it than punk. So you're pop to me. So we're gonna list off some technologies, and and from pop to punk, what kind of, I want you to think about like the impact and kind of when we're going to see it when you're evaluating it from pop to punk. And feel free to put in other music genres to kind of rate it there. In the sense of punk being like, hey, it is literally the coolest thing out there, but no one listens to it, or it's not going to get a lot of use, and we're not going to see it a lot. To something that's, Kiss, where it's going to have a giant impact, potentially change a lot of the industry, and everyone's going to know and use it. So does that metric work with you, Peter? Any?
Sure. There's probably other quadrants in the metric there, but like it's great, but nobody's going to use it, or it's lousy and everybody's going to use it.
Yeah.
Like VHS, for example, versus beta, but that's just my opinion.
All right. Well,
Which a lot of people probably don't even know what those two things are.
I want to first start off with, because it was in the chat from Aaron, was long duration storage. Now, there's a couple types of long duration storage out there. You see flow batteries, which are your kind of traditional electrolyzer anodes, chemical storage, and then you have things like pumped hydro and kind of kinetic. If Volt Energy is going to actually build a giant tower with bricks, people should Google that if they want to see something cool and odd. But impact of long duration storage, and where is it?
Where
Oh,
is
like
it?
rate
I
it.
mean,
I'll pop the punk.
it's well, it's it's probably in between because it's absolutely needed.
Mhm.
Some of it is cool, some of it is stupid. Energy Vault, let's say it's not cool.
Well, I was going to say that
Um,
it sounds like reggae.
Anyway, music comparisons for me are probably not a good idea because I'm not familiar with too much different music. But like, I mean, pumped hydro's been around for 100 years,
Hmm.
and it's proven. The issue with pumped hydro is you kind of need certain locations that will work. It does have environmental impacts because you're going to flood areas to build the reservoirs. You can do off river or I can't, I think it's well, anyway, you can build a pumped hydro that's basically a circular storage within, a lower reservoir, upper reservoir with just makeup water basically, and it's not blocking the flow of a waterway. So
Hmm.
there's less environmental impacts from that because you're not building a dam for that blocks a free flowing river. But those projects are expensive and they take a long time to license because all hydro projects have to go through FERC, and FERC is not renowned for speed.
Yeah.
But the batteries, I mean, long duration flow batteries, I think those are going to be more on the shorter end of the long duration. So in other words, pumped hydro, you could get days of energy storage out of it, depending on the size of the reservoirs. But flow batteries, you're probably going to be a day at the most, maybe. I mean, obviously you can change it. You put more
Yeah.
tanks in the system, and it's easily expandable, but is that expansion worth the cost? Because the longer the duration is, the less capacity the less your capacity factor is because you might be using 4 or 8 hours, every week, but if you need 2 or 3 days, you might want to use that a couple times a year, in which case, you're paying for the expense of building that long storage and you're only using it a little. So, but I mean, technologically, it's feasible. There's compressed air energy storage. Those are typically going to be 8 to 12, maybe possibly even 24 hours. There's liquid air storage, which is kind of the same thing, except instead of compressing the air and stuffing it underground in a cavern, you liquefy it and store it in a tank. So that would take less room to build,
Hmm.
but it would be probably a bit more expensive, capital intensive. Well, I guess
All
it's
right.
kind of a
Let's
toss
go a
up.
little bit more rapid
So
fire on
yeah,
on some of these, because I know there's the whole like, well, we got to, you want to have like a lot of confidence and certainty in there and
yeah.
the responses to it. But, I mean, oh, well, actually, on the long duration storage one, I'll mention we're going to have a discussion with the head of SMUD generation, hopefully in a couple months, and he has some thoughts on long duration storage,
Mhm.
which will be interesting for people to check out. But let's talk about other grid enhancing technologies, reconductoring and dynamic line ratings. Pop or punk?
Well, dynamic line ratings is, how would you say that? Because it's fairly easy to do and it's cheap because dynamic line ratings, you're basically not changing, you're not adding anything except sensors to check the condition of the conductor on the line and determine if it's got more capacity available or not. So your only expense is adding those sensors. But there are certain, I mean, there's a lot of things you have to measure too. So you have
Mhm.
you have to measure the temperature, the wind speed, the sag, because you might be clearance limited rather than conductor temperature limit. conductor temperature limited. And of course, the higher you push the lines, the hotter they get. So that does increase the risk of a failure, but it's probably not that significant because basically the system is designed for failure. You're supposed to be able to lose a element and nothing bad is supposed to happen. So
Yeah. And then reconductoring.
yeah, and reconduct you can do there's different ways you can reconductor. There's like new high-tech conductors. There's actually some that are a little more old tech, but they would basically be replacing the conductor that's already there, and they have more capacity, but they're not necessarily any heavier, which means you can just put them on the existing structures and not much additional work has to be done other than
Okay.
taking off the old conductor, putting on the new.
So they both
So,
sound pretty pop, I
mhm,
guess. That they'll be used hopefully a lot. How about virtual power plants?
that's, I would say right now that's punk, but it has a future. I mean, because there's a lot of resources out there, rooftop solar and then home batteries, that if you could tie those together, and a lot of people are, you know, reticent to let the utility control their stuff. But, if you had a third party and you signed contracts with that third party, and then that third party then signed agreements with the utility, and that third party could coordinate a number of customers in an area, and that's what a virtual power plant is. You could potentially, each individual participant could make some money. The problem right now is that, getting those, I think there may be some regulations that make it difficult. Plus, finding the customers, getting
So
the
if it's
customers, that's
if
that's
it's
a that's
punk,
that's a
it's
challenge
like
too.
Blink 182, the Dude Ranch before they got really big. And everyone's like, these guys are good. And all right, now I got just two more for you on
Okay.
it. And
All right.
these ones will be just, let's hit them quickly on it. And that's fast chargers, as ubiquitous as gas stations are now. And I asked that because you're also a big EV enthusiast. And then why not just build the grid like we did in the 60s and 70s?
Okay, well, I'll answer the last one first because since technologies are changing and generation resources are different, you can't build the grid the way you did in the 60s and 70s. In the 60s and 70s, it was basically central planning. The utilities forecasted the load. They said, okay, I need so many different resources. These are the most economic resources. I'm going to put them here, here, and here. And then the transmission planner said, okay, so now I'll build transmission lines from resource one to the load and resource two. Now it's a little different because the developers who are independent of the utilities, they go out and they pick locations, and you don't know where those locations are going to be until they request interconnection. And then if they pick a good spot, great. If they don't, now you've got the transmission planner back building lines again, but it's a completely different process. And so that's why you don't want to do it that way. So what was the first one? It was it
Fast chargers as
fast
ubiquitous
chargers.
as gas stations.
I would say that that's not going to happen because, 90% of EV charging should be done either at work or at home. And so the fast chargers are needed well, for commercial use, but then they're going to probably be on site of the commercial entities and not available to the public. But for private vehicles, then the only need for fast chargers in most cases is going to be for road trips. And so you're not going to need as many of them, but you do need them in convenient locations and well spaced so that people don't have to worry about the range anxiety thing. So so
Mhm.
so as far as number goes, I would say there'll be fewer, but and energy capacity to put energy into the vehicle will probably be less too, because number one, EVs are more efficient, and also 90% of their energy is going to come from someplace else probably. So
Okay. So I'm going to kind of summarize up what we've kind of like heard today and from you on when it comes to the grid is that if I'm planning a project, one of the first things I need to do is go and look at transmission and distribution data that's available from utilities to see potential supply and demand at different locations because I need to know what potential infrastructure costs I might incur. Um, and I need to then be able to make a decision between whether do I just want to have chargers or do I want to add storage? And storage because of time or demand and the cost of energy on different times is leading to a lot more people when they're doing generation projects to incorporate storage in it. So that way they can, sell the electricity when it's expensive or when it's needed. And all of these things have trade-offs, but one of the things that is going to kind of slow your project down probably the most is that you have a lot of moving parts that you need to bring together, whether it's, your local jurisdiction's regulations on building, whether it's what the utility is able to provide you in a certain time frame, or even the parts, because various things are on back orders for 18 months. And don't forget that updating the transformer is probably is a really big and hard and difficult task. Well, easy if you have a transformer and have all the money,
Mhm.
but a bigger part of the plan on it. And when it comes to, a lot of these new technologies, they have a place, but it's also, there's a trade-off on all of them, which I guess, kind of makes sense. And some of them, it almost sounded like, especially on the dynamic line ratings, like, it's like we could have it a lot sooner, but we don't because it's an easy, cheap sort of thing to do. And all of these have risks. So you need to think about resiliency because my power is on most of the time. And, we always like to make fun of between SMUD and PG&E on that, but PG&E has power on the majority of the time and, does a pretty good job of not having an entire state go down, unlike other utilities across the country. So does that kind of sum it up, I guess?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, one thing I would say is that, when you're looking at a project, you initially said transmission and distribution. The distribution maps are available.
Okay.
Transmission maps currently aren't. However, FERC Order 2023, which was issued
2023.
earlier this year, yeah, probably 2023, because that's the number. Yeah.
Yeah. They like
Anyway,
to play with
it
those
it
numbers.
it requires that utilities provide what they call a heat map, which gives you locations on the transmission system where capacity is available for interconnection. So it makes it
Um,
easier for the developers so they don't pick the wrong spot.
all right. And I'll leave this kind of final thought with you. What technology or upcoming grid related activity excites you?
I think planning for the decarbonization of the grid, that's exciting because if you're just saying I want to site a bunch of renewables or I'm planning for load growth, I've been doing that for 40 years, right? But electrification and decarbonization, it drives the load growth. However, the interesting thing is that according to NREL, the load growth through due to electrification, even in their high electrification study case, the compound annual growth rate is actually less than like from the 20s to, let's see, actually I have it right here. I wrote it down. Um, from 1950 to 2016, it's actually that growth rate was faster. So if somebody says, "Oh, this is going to cause tremendous increase in demand on the grid, and the grid can't handle it," well, it handled like three times as much from 1950 to 2016, and yeah, there were a few outages, but it survived. So it should be able to handle what we've got projected for the next 30 years. So
And that's, with the planning make and that they actually build the things they're saying they're building, right?
yes, well,
Yeah.
yes, of course.
Yeah. Which I think is kind of interesting because everyone says it's not going to be a handle AI. But one thing that, I think we always should remember is that it's a market out there. If there's enough demand, it will get built or AI isn't actually providing the return and can't buy the power.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in a lot of cases, I mean, it obviously depends, but like for AI, if a data center developer says, I need to build this data center and the utility is going, I can't serve you, I don't have enough generation. I mean, if the guy picks the right spot for his data center, he could build a generation right next to it. And it could be
Yeah.
renewable and he could have some batteries. And I mean, he could run his data center off of renewables.
Yeah. I think, that's we're going to end it there. I see some good ch questions in the chat. I tried to get a lot of them reflected in the discussion there. If you're looking to create a business around it or reach out to people, you can always check us at cleanstart.org. How could people reach out to you, Peter?
Well, I guess they could write to me at my SACEV email, which is rpmackin2000 at gmail.com.
All
And
right. Or
uh,
visit qualis.com if they want to see what Qualis does.
yeah, Qualis. Yeah, Qualis is more of a like a all-in power engineering firm.
Hmm.
So we do not just what I do, but we also do engineering design and construction of large scale facility distribution and transmission. We're doing some data center designs too. So, yep.
All right. So with that, I want to thank Peter for joining us today. And I tried to catch your title on there, but from Qualis and SAC EV. And if you're joining us on a future event, you'll get to hear more insight always from Peter on it, and we appreciate it. I also want to thank our sponsors again, and that's, SMUD, River City Bank, eh, SMUD, River City Bank, Bloom, Fresno, the Wet Center, and Chico Start. If you have a startup, help us connect. They all want to connect with you to see how they can support you. And then also invite you guys to our next webinar that's coming up on August 8th, Vehicle to the Grid Technology with Lion Electric. That should be an exciting one. And we're going to be talking more about charging on the grid with portable fast charging platforms from with Sean Hinckley, I think Open Charge. I might have to double check the name on that there. And then later we're going to be talking with Wind Harvest on innovating in wind technology. And keep an eye out for that with good
Yeah.
discussion with SMUD. So thank you for attending. Follow us on all of our channels and have a good day.